Welcome to the Podcast Lab, your go-to space for raw conversations, curious questions, and inspiring stories from around the world. Whether you're here to learn, laugh, or just listen in, this is where ideas take shape and voices come alive. Ready to dive into fresh perspectives and thought-provoking discussions? Let's get started. This is the Podcast Lab. Subscribe now and never miss an episode.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today on something really incredible, hidden heroes. We're going to unearth those stories of people who had like a truly massive impact, but haven't really gotten the full recognition that they deserve.
Yeah, it's kind of like we're opening up this like forgotten wing of the history museum, you know? And we're finding the folks who literally changed the world, but they didn't always get like top billing for it.
Exactly. Like we're talking about the person who basically revolutionized how we treat leprosy back in the early 1900s. And then we've got this doctor who like basically pioneered the idea of washing your hands. And we're going to talk about a teenager who was showing unbelievable bravery even before Rosa Parks. Get ready, because this is going to be full of those, whoa, I had no idea moments.
Yeah, for real. And I think it's like, these are the kinds of people and stories that really push us to think differently about like whose stories we tell and why. Sometimes, you know, it's the people working behind the scenes that are the most important figures.
Okay, so let's jump right in with Alice Ball. Now, picture this. The early 1900s. Leprosy was a huge deal, really serious, and like people were so afraid of it, there were barely any good ways to treat it.
Yeah, and it was very stigmatized, definitely.
Absolutely. And Alice, get this, she's only 23 years old, and she develops this groundbreaking treatment. It's called the Ball method, and it uses traumugura oil as an injectable treatment.
And you really got to stop and like let that sink in for a minute, you know? Imagine being a young Black woman in science at that time. It's the early 1900s. This is a field that was basically closed off to anyone who wasn't a white man. Just her determination to even try to make a breakthrough it's incredible.
It really is mind-blowing. And her method, it was used all over the world until antibiotics came along. But the really sad part, she died super young. And get this, her work, it was almost totally forgotten.
Oh yeah, and you know what else?
What's that?
Often someone else got the credit for her work. It's just wild.
Her story really makes you wonder just how many brilliant minds we've missed out on throughout history just because of, well, you know, because of prejudice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, it shows how progress isn't just slowed down by not knowing stuff. It's slowed down by who's actually allowed to, like, share what they know.
Okay, so let's move on to another person who totally challenged the system. Ignaz Semmelweis. Imagine, if you can, the medical world back in the mid-1800s. Now, the idea of germs, practically unheard of.
Yeah, nobody really knew about germs then.
Right. So Semmelweis, he's working in a maternity ward, and he notices something really disturbing. Way more people are dying in hospitals after childbirth than people giving birth at home.
Well, yeah, back then, doctors would go straight from doing autopsies to examining patients, and they didn't wash their hands in between. It's kind of hard to believe now, knowing what we know about how infections spread.
I know, right? So Semmelweis, he starts to think that something's being passed from patient to patient. So what does he do? He insists that everyone has to start washing their hands with a chlorine solution before they examine anyone.
Chlorine?
Yeah. And guess what? Death rates just plummet. You'd think he'd be a hero, right?
You would think.
Yeah.
But his ideas, they were so radical, like way out there for the time. So his peers, they just ridiculed him. They straight up resisted what he was saying. They just couldn't even grasp the concept of germ theory.
It's a pretty harsh reminder that even if you have an idea that could save lives, people might still fight you on it.
Yeah, especially if it goes against what they already believe.
Exactly. So what happened to Semmelweis? Well, he ended up basically ostracized from the medical community and sent to an asylum where he died. And get this, it took years for the rest of the world to figure out what he already knew.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time. It shows you that pushing for progress can mean you're going against everyone else, and you don't even pay a price for it.
All right, now for our last hidden hero for today, someone whose story is super connected to this key moment in the fight for civil rights. Everyone knows Rosa Parks, right? She refused to give up her seat on a bus because of segregation.
Right, and her action was super important. But what a lot of people don't know is that 9 months before Rosa Parks, there was this 15-year-old, Claudette Colvin. And guess what? She did the same thing. right there in Montgomery, Alabama.
It's amazing to think about a teenager standing up to, like, the full weight of segregation. It makes you really appreciate those who came before us and how much courage they had.
It really does. So yeah, Claudette's case, it actually helped to get the Montgomery bus boycott rolling. But here's the thing, you rarely hear her story.
That's so true.
It's like, even within movements fighting for justice, some voices end up being forgotten.
And it makes you think, what if Claudette Colvin had gotten the same support as Rosa Parks? Would the whole story of the civil rights movement be different? And how many other stories of incredible bravery are still out there just waiting to be rediscovered?
What's fascinating about these three people is that they each, they challenge the norms of their time in their own way. Alice Ball. She broke down barriers in science. Ignaz Semmelweis, he went up against the core beliefs of the medical establishment. And Claudette Colvin, she stood up for her rights, even as a teenager.
And what I think is so powerful is that none of them were doing this for fame or recognition. They were driven by this desire to make a difference, even if it meant facing a ton of resistance. Their stories really make you consider the price of progress and the sacrifices people make to try to make the world better.
Yeah, and they show how history gets shaped and whose contributions get amplified or just totally ignored. Mm-hmm. It's not always about the loudest people, right? It's often the people working quietly behind the scenes, pushing those boundaries and fighting for what they believe in.
It's amazing how much we can learn from their struggles and their wins. These stories aren't just about individuals. They're about understanding how progress works, what helps it, and what holds it back.
Totally. And their paths were definitely hard, but each one of them left a real mark on the world and helped to make a better future. Their stories, they're not just inspiring, they're like calls to action. They remind us that we each have the potential to do something, to make a difference, even when things are tough.
It's kind of wild, we often get caught up in these huge historical narratives, but sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that happen, like in those everyday moments.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Think about the people who might not be making headlines, but their actions or making waves in their communities and even further out, those are the hidden heroes we see all the time.
So true. Okay, let's talk about Viola Luzer for a minute. Just imagine, okay, you're a housewife in Detroit, you've got 5 kids, and you're watching the civil rights movement happening down south. It's having a huge impact on you. Well, Viola, she couldn't just sit there and watch.
Yeah, it was 1965, and things were so tense. It was a real struggle for racial equality. The Selma to Montgomery marches were going on, and Viola, she just felt like she had to be a part of it.
So she gets in her car and drives all the way from Michigan to Alabama to join that final march. She even helped to drive some of the civil rights activists around. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. She left her family behind to step right into this really volatile situation.
And it was definitely volatile. Tragically, Viola was driving back from taking some marchers where they needed to go, and members of the Ku Klux Klan, they murdered her. It's a pretty stark reminder that even when you're fighting for justice, there are real dangers involved.
It's just awful. Her story makes you think, what makes someone, an everyday person, decide to do something so extraordinary? It says a lot about her empathy, her belief that there are things worth putting yourself on the line for.
Definitely. And you know what else Viola Liuzzo's story shows us? It shows us that heroism can come from anywhere. It doesn't matter where you're from or what your social status is. It's about anyone who chooses to follow their conscience.
So true. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Fred Korematsu. His story takes us back to World War II. So picture this. The U.S. has just been attacked at Pearl Harbor. Fear and paranoia are everywhere. And it leads to this really terrible thing, the internment of Japanese Americans, people living on the West Coast.
It's insane. Over 120,000 people, and a lot of them were American citizens. They were forced out of their homes and put into camps just because of their ancestry. It's one of those really dark moments in American history that shows how fear can completely destroy civil liberties.
And Fred Korematsu, he flat out refused to go along with it. He said it was totally unconstitutional and discriminatory and violated his rights as an American.
And he was only 23 when he did this. He stood up to the government, and his case eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was a huge moment because it forced the country to confront the injustice of those internment camps.
But unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against him. They actually upheld the government's actions. It shows that even when you're fighting for what's right, you might not win.
But here's the thing. Korematsu's fight didn't end there. Years later, it came out that the government had, hidden some really important information during his case.
Seriously?
Yeah. And because of that, his conviction was overturned in 1983. It was a huge victory for civil rights.
That's amazing. His story is a good reminder that fighting for justice is a long process. You might have setbacks, but if you're persistent and you stick to the truth, you can eventually win. What Fred Korematsu did set a real precedent for standing up to injustice, and his story is still inspiring people to fight for what's right.
Okay, now let's dive into a story that brings up some really important questions about science, ethics, and individual rights. The story of Henrietta Lacks.
So the year is 1951. Henrietta Lacks, a young black woman, is diagnosed with cervical cancer. And while she's getting treatment, doctors take a sample of her tumor cells. But, and this is key, they don't tell her they're doing it, and they don't ask for her permission. This was a common thing to do back then, but what happened next is really remarkable.
So they're looking at Henrietta's cells, and they realize they've never seen anything like them. These cells were able to do something no one had seen before. They could reproduce outside of the body. They became the very first immortal human cell line that could grow in a lab, and they were called HeLa cells.
And those cells, they totally changed medical research. We're talking breakthroughs in cancer, vaccine development, even gene mapping. It's estimated that something like 70,000 studies have used HeLa cells, which means they've probably helped to save countless lives.
But here's the problem. For years and years, Henrietta's family had no idea about any of this. They didn't know how much her cells had done for medicine, and they never got any money from their use. Plus, they themselves had trouble getting access to good health care.
It's just not right. Henrietta Lacks' story really makes it clear that we need to think about ethics when it comes to scientific progress. We can't forget about the human side of things. It makes you ask, who's really benefiting from these scientific discoveries, and who's paying the price?
Her story also makes it clear that informed consent is critical. We have to respect people, especially in medical research. While Henrietta's contribution to science is undeniable, her story shows how complicated things get when you're talking about using someone's biological material.
You know, these three stories, they're all so different, but they all show the same thing. Everyday people have this incredible capacity for courage and can make a real impact on the world. Viola Liuzzo, Fred Korematsu, and Henrietta Lacks, each one of them in their own way, challenge us to think about how we fight for what's right, how we handle ethical problems, and how we acknowledge the unsung heroes who shape our world.
They remind us that being a hero isn't always about getting attention and praise. Sometimes it's about those quiet acts of standing up for what's right, showing compassion, and never giving up.
And they also show that the road to a more just and equal world isn't always straightforward. There are going to be setbacks, sacrifices, and complicated situations along the way. But the stories of these hidden heroes give us hope and remind us that even when things are tough, our individual choices can change things for the better.
And it's not just these incredible figures that should inspire us. Think about the people in your own life, the people who have that same kind of courage, compassion, and commitment to making a positive impact. They're the hidden heroes all around us, and we need to celebrate them.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? All these amazing people we've been talking about, they all started out as regular folks just like us.
Totally. Like, none of them were born knowing they were going to be heroes. They became heroes by the choices they made, what they did, and like being dedicated to something bigger than themselves.
And that's what's so inspiring to me. It's not like heroism is this thing you're born with or some special talent, you know. It's about what we choose to do, the actions we take, how we impact the world around us.
It really changes how you see things, doesn't it? It's not about waiting for someone else to come along and be the hero. It's about realizing that, hey, we all have that potential.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be these big dramatic things either. It's those everyday things, you know, being brave, being kind, showing compassion. Those things spread out and make the world a better, more just place.
What if, and just think about this for a second, what if the real challenge isn't about finding heroes, but actually becoming one?
Whoa. That's a powerful thought. It's like a call to action, right? We're not just sitting here watching the world go by. We're part of it. We can shape our own stories and do something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. It's about realizing that heroism is a choice, like something you practice every day by lining up what you do with what you believe in and trying to make a positive impact, whether it's a big one or a small one.
And sometimes it's those little things that end up mattering the most, right? Saying something nice to someone you don't know, listening to a friend who needs to talk, helping someone who's having a hard time. Those are the everyday hero moments that can completely change someone's day or even their life. They can even spark a movement.
It's all about understanding that we're connected to each other And what we do, even if it seems small, can have a ripple effect way bigger than we could imagine.
I love that. It goes back to something we were talking about earlier, how heroism isn't about wanting to be recognized or get something out of it. It's about doing what's right because you genuinely care and have compassion. It's about showing up for ourselves, for each other, and for the world. It's just the right thing to do.
But when we embrace this idea of being everyday heroes, we're honoring all those people who came before us, the ones who fought for a better world, even when nobody was watching or giving them credit. We keep their stories alive, not just in books, but in the way we live our lives.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of hidden heroes, I hope you're leaving with more than just feeling amazed and inspired. I hope you also feel a sense of purpose and possibility.
Remember, heroism isn't this far-off concept for special people.
Yeah.
It's in all of us. It's a choice we can make every single day to live the right way, to stand up for what we believe in, to take care of each other, and to bring a little more light into the world.
And who knows, maybe someday someone will be telling your story, talking about all the amazing things you did to make a difference, even the quiet ones. But until then, go out there and be the hero the world needs. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.